Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. Yet to seize the meaning of this day, we must recall darker times. 3.5 centuries ago, the first Negroes arrived at Jamestown. They did not arrive in brave ships in search of a home for freedom. They did not mingle fear and joy in expectation that in this new world anything would be possible to a man strong enough to reach for it. They came in darkness and they came in chains. And today, we strike away the last major shackle of those fierce and ancient bonds.
Joining me now, MSNBC's Joy Reid and Peniel Joseph, director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University, and the author of Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. Professor Joseph, this is very much a part of the story of race in America, this decision today. Your reaction to it?
Well, I think it's a disgrace for democracy, because when we think about the Voting Rights Act, it's going to be really the capstone of a period between 1954 and 1965 that I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement. So we think about the Brown decision, we think about Rosa Parks, Emmett Till being assassinated, Little Rock, the sit-in movements of February 1st, 1960, Medgar Evers, John Kennedy's June 11th, 63 speech, March on Washington, the Freedom Riders, Civil Rights Act, and then finally August 6th, 1965, you get to the Voting Rights Act. And millions of Americans participated, black, white, Jewish, Latino, to have a multicultural, multiracial democracy, and the capstone was that Voting Rights Act.
And Joy, the majority opinion today did not seem to have a grasp of everything that Professor Joseph just described.
Right. It was sort of this kind of whitewashed version of history that you do hear a lot from Republicans saying, that was then, this is now, we don't want to make these states pay for the sins of the past. But I think a lot of it was so blatantly disingenuous, that sort of gauzy language about how the Voting Rights Act succeeded, mission accomplished, we don't need that anymore. And then sort of challenging Congress, saying, well, they should have come up with a new formula. Well, they're forgetting the history again. The Voting Rights Act was challenged almost immediately. 1966, there was already a court case challenging it. It was another one 3 years later. You're talking about the first time they tried to renew it in 1970, the Democrats worrying that any change to it could bring the whole bill down. They wound up giving us the 18-year-olds ability to vote, bringing down the voting age. 75, the same thing happened. You had Barbara Jordan heroically trying to expand the Voting Rights Act to include language minorities, to bring in Hispanics who are trying to vote in California and New York, and worrying all the time that just that change, the tweak, could bring the whole thing down again. And these were with Democratic Congresses. So when you think about how wrenching and difficult it was to change the formula, that's the reason why when they finally did a big expansion, it was 25 years in order to solidify it and not have to go through that every 5 years.
But this is the history of congressional formulas. It's very difficult to get them shaped in the first place with 50 states and all those congressional districts, and that's true whether it's the Farm Bill of the 1930s, Medicaid, all sorts of things that have these formulas. And it's why it's very difficult politically to undo them. It's also why every time you renew one of those laws, you are actually reauthorizing that particular formula as the best one we can come up with under these governing circumstances.
Yeah, and when we think about the whole notion that the formula needed to be changed, that's really nonsense, because what the formula did was preemptively prevent the kind of discrimination that had occurred for hundreds of years. Because remember, 1619 is when the first African slaves came to Jamestown. 1776 we're founded as a nation, and for almost the next 200 years, it's either slavery or state-sanctioned segregation, Jim Crow. So the idea that 40 years later, or 45, 48 years later, we can stop because we're such a fantastic success, it really is disingenuous, but also I want to talk about Congressman John Lewis, who was beaten March 7th, Bloody Sunday, 1965. March 9th, they did Turnaround Tuesday, and March 15th, you just had a clip of President Johnson. President Johnson made a heroic speech before a joint address of Congress where he talks about, and we shall overcome. And he compares those demonstrators who were beaten in Selma to the patriots who fought at Lexington and Concord. So the whole notion of voting rights, this is millions of people have put their lives on the line. Congressman Lewis, his skull was cracked and fractured for democracy. So this is a bad day for our democracy, and it's ultra ironic because they're doing it on the 50th anniversary of 1963, which is one of the best years in American history because of the progress we made in terms of civil rights.
Let's listen to what Congressman Lewis had to say about this today.
I didn't think that on that day when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act that I would live to see 5 members of the United States Supreme Court undoing what President Johnson did with those pens. And I had one of the pens that they used to sign that law at my home in Atlanta, and when I get home, I would pick up that pen.
Let's take a look at Congressman Lewis back then, before he was in the Congress, at that bill signing with LBJ.
Come on around. It hadn't been long since I could get that together.
Joy, this Supreme Court majority seems to think that the issues that were being addressed that day have evaporated.
Yeah, they're using that image as an excuse and Barack Obama's election, and they're actually attempting to simply blame the victims. They're saying, well, you African-American Latino voters who came out in big numbers, we're going to put this on you. Your coming out proves we don't need those laws anymore. And how disingenuous for it to be John Roberts. You know, John Roberts can talk about 40 years and 50 years have passed. John Roberts had the same attitude toward the Voting Rights Act in 1982 when he was working for the Reagan Justice Department. This is a guy who's been trying to get rid of the Voting Rights Act since 82, and that was 17 years after what happened, Bloody Sunday and all these other things, not 40. So his attitude hasn't changed, his rationale has changed.
Joy Reid and Professor Peniel Joseph, thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thank you.